Deep within the history of the North, beneath the shadows of the cold Scandinavian forests, burrows one of the most astonishing and controversial peoples, the Vikings. They were not mere invaders, as history books often portray, but a complete civilization that blended war and trade, pagan faith and the pursuit of eternity, the sword and glory. In this documentary, we will take you on a long journey spanning centuries, across seas and rivers, from the mountains of Norway to the shores of England, from the castles of France to the deserts of Al-Andalus, all the way to the coast of North America, where the Vikings preceded Columbus by 5 centuries. We will tell you the story as it happened, no fantasy, no fabricated myths, but a narrative based on documents, historical records, verifiable maps, and authenticated sources. We will dive into the daily lives of these seafarers, their religions, their governance, and the secret of the awe they inspired, which led the kings of Europe to pay them gold simply to cease their attacks. Fasten your seatbelts and listen closely, for you are about to encounter one of the most compelling chapters in human history. This is where the Viking saga begins. If you enjoy this kind of deep, documentary content, please support us. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, as your support enables us to produce more long series that require continuous research and historical verification. But now, let's plunge into the heart of the action and start from the very beginning, from the moment the Vikings were born, when their name was not yet cemented, and Europe had no idea what awaited it. In the far north of Europe, in the lands known today as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the Vikings emerged. They were primarily agricultural people, living amidst a harsh environment of towering mountains, narrow fjords, and endless, dense forests. Their resources were limited, and their farmland was scarce, especially in Norway, where the mountains restricted expansion. But they possessed an indomitable spirit, creating a life based on adaptation. The sea became a part of their identity, not just a source of food, but an open road to wealth and conquest. They lived in small villages led by tribal chieftains, governed by oral laws and local assemblies known as the Thing. Their religion was pagan. They believed in many gods, the most famous being Odin, the god of wisdom and death, Thor, the god of thunder, and Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. Initially, they were not a unified political entity but a collection of scattered tribes. However, towards the end of the 8th century AD, things began to change. The population grew, resources became scarcer, and the need for expansion emerged. This is where the true Viking Age began. In 793 AD, an incident occurred that echoed across Europe like thunder, a sudden raid on the isolated monastery of Lindisfarne on the eastern coast of England. The monks were at peace when they were suddenly attacked by men coming from the sea in their longships, with gleaming weapons. They descended like ghosts, not understanding the monks' language and respecting no sanctity. They spilled blood, plundered treasures, and left the monastery a smoking ruin. This was the first recorded Viking raid in history. As soon as the news spread, fear gripped Christian Europe. Monasteries began to fortify, and villages built walls. But the Vikings did not stop. This was just the beginning. This raid proved that the North Sea was no longer a natural barrier, but a bridge for invaders. It showed that the Vikings did not fear the coasts, but sought them out. From that day on, Europe entered a new phase, recorded as the Age of Northern Terror. Everyone realized that these men from the north were not just pirates, but a rising force that couldn't be easily stopped. What truly distinguished the Vikings was not only their courage in battle but their exceptional skill in shipbuilding and seafaring. They possessed a unique type of vessel known as the Longship, Drakkar, narrow, light, but sturdy. Driven by oars when the wind died, and by sails when it blew, these ships were capable of sailing on the high seas but could also navigate shallow rivers and penetrate deep into the continent. With these ships, they were able to surprise their enemies from unexpected directions. They did not fight like regular armies, but as small, fast-striking, and quickly retreating units. They benefited from the weak European organization at the time and the kingdom's preoccupation with internal wars. Each time, they returned laden with loot or captives. These ships were not just a means of transport, but symbols of power, comparable in awe to modern aircraft carriers. Every time the coastal inhabitants saw them, fear crept into their hearts. Thus, the Vikings' naval capabilities formed the essential backbone of their expansion, making the sea their domain and the source of their dominance. After the Lindisfarne raid, England was never the same. Once the Vikings had tasted the ease of plunder, they returned repeatedly, targeting monasteries, ports, and open coasts. During the 9th century AD, they intensified their attacks, not just on England, but on Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man. They were no longer satisfied with brief raids but began to settle. In Ireland, they founded Dublin, which started as a summer camp and grew into a major trading centre. In northern England, they established what became known as the Danelaw, areas directly under their rule where Viking laws applied. They made York their main base, and their identity became cemented as settlers, not passing invaders. During this period, Europeans often described them in records as pagans from the sea, attributing their arrival to divine punishment. Yet, behind this image lay organizational brilliance and the ability to establish and govern colonies and set up trade networks that transcended the boundaries of war. Despite the resistance they faced, they managed to assert themselves on the map of the British Isles for decades. They soon moved south toward the heart of Europe. In France, the Frankish kingdoms were preoccupied with internal conflicts, providing fertile ground for Viking raids. In 845 AD, a chieftain named Ragnar Lothbrok, a controversial figure in history, led a huge fleet that breached the river Seine and reached Paris. The defense was weak, forcing King Charles the Bald to pay a huge ransom in gold to make the Vikings withdraw. Raids continued afterwards, and not just Paris was threatened, but all the ports along the major rivers, the Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne. The Vikings set up seasonal camps near these rivers and launched deeper incursions into Europe, sometimes reaching Switzerland, Italy, and even northern Spain. But the climax came in the early 10th century when the French king negotiated with a Viking leader named Rollo and granted him a region in northern France known today as Normandy, in exchange for his loyalty. That area later became a major civilized base, giving rise to new conquerors, the Normans, who would invade England in the 11th century. This was proof that the Vikings were not just thieves but empire builders when given the chance. The Vikings' ambitions did not stop at the North Sea, they extended south to where the sun was warmer. In the mid-9th century, their ships crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and attacked the coasts of Islamic Al-Andalus, entering the Guadalquivir River and looting the city of Seville. It was a shock to the Muslims who hadn't anticipated such an attack. Despite the raid's initial success, the Vikings faced fierce resistance from the Umayyad armies, sustained heavy losses, and were forced to retreat. Yet, this invasion proved their ability to sail long distances and penetrate lands that were unfamiliar with them. After Al-Andalus, they headed towards the coasts of Morocco, Syracuse in Sicily, and even some areas of Italy. However, unlike their raids in the north, they failed to settle in these regions due to stronger local organization and different geography. Nevertheless, they left their mark on the imagination of these peoples and in Islamic documents that spoke of the Magus, Zoroastrians/fire worshippers, or the foreigners from the sea. These campaigns, even if temporary, proved one thing: the Vikings feared nothing, neither distance, climate, nor other great civilizations. Away from the raids, the Vikings had another side, the trader. Through the major rivers of Eastern Europe, they began establishing trade routes with the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. The Slavs called them the Varangians, or Vari, and they appeared in the earliest Russian documents as the founders of the first political entities there. They guided their ships along the Dnieper and Volga rivers, passing through Kiev, which became an important center for them, and eventually reaching the Black Sea. From there, they established trade relations with Byzantium, signed treaties, and occasionally served as mercenaries in the Byzantine Imperial Guard. They also traded with the Islamic world, and Arab coins, dirhams, have appeared in their graves, a clear sign of extensive communication between the two parties. These Eastern Vikings are known today as the Rus, who later gave Russia its name. These voyages were not easy, but fraught with danger. However, the greed for gold, silk, and spices made the risks worthwhile. Thus, the Vikings were not just invaders, but part of a global trade network extending from Sweden to Baghdad, and from Kiev to Constantinople. Away from wars and voyages, what was the daily life of the Vikings like? They were primarily an agrarian society, relying on farming and animal husbandry alongside sea hunting and tool-making. The Viking home was a longhouse made of wood, with a central fire pit around which the family gathered. Women played a pivotal role. They managed household affairs, participated in trade, and even occasionally in battles. Children learned fighting skills, riding, and weapon-making from an early age. Their laws were enforced through local assemblies, based on customs and traditions, not written texts. Religion was part of every moment of their lives. They believed that a warrior who died bravely would be welcomed in Valhalla, the hall of warriors in the afterlife. They held rituals, offered sacrifices, and predicted the future through priestesses and priests. They also practiced arts such as carving, engraving, and jewelry making, leaving us priceless treasures that reflect their taste and precision. The Vikings were more than just warriors. They were a vibrant society with a rich culture of rituals, arts, and stories. Viking society was organized, even if it appeared barbaric to outsiders. People were divided into three main classes: the Jarls, nobles/chiefs, the leaders of the tribes and landowners; the Carls, freemen, the common people, farmers, traders, and craftsmen, who enjoyed basic rights; and finally, the thralls, slaves, who were captives of war or debtors, often sold or used for hard labor. It is noteworthy that despite its classes, this society sometimes allowed a slave to gain freedom and a poor man to become rich through trade or raiding. The woman in this society enjoyed a relatively privileged status, having the right to divorce, inherit property, and sometimes captain ships or manage lands in the husband's absence. Society was based on the principle of honor, with disputes resolved in the thing, a council of tribal men who discussed issues, issued judgments, and decided policies. The system was simple yet effective, balancing freedom and responsibility. Despite lacking a central authority, the social discipline was clear. Thus, the Viking tribes were not mere scattered groups, but societies with their own systems, values, and unique style of governance and livelihood. The Vikings had a unique spiritual world, charged with myths and enigmatic symbols. They did not follow a revealed religion but believed in multiple deities, led by Odin, the god of wisdom and war, Thor, the god of thunder, and Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. Their religious stories wove together a coherent world of 9 realms, all suspended on a giant tree called Yggdrasil. They believed the world would end in a great battle called Ragnarok, where the gods would face the forces of evil, concluding with the death of all, only for the world to be reborn. These stories were not just for entertainment, they explained nature, death, life, and destiny. They were told by the tribe's poets, engraved on stones, and carved into wood and bone. Every ritual, from birth to death, followed the orbit of these beliefs. Death, especially in battle, was considered a passage to Valhalla, the Hall of Glory, where eternal warriors celebrated under the patronage of Odin. It was a religion that embraced the values of courage and honor, but also filled with the fear of the unknown and the mysterious forces lurking in every corner of this ancient world. The Vikings would not have become a legend without their superiority in shipbuilding. They designed longships known as the Drakkar, light and fast, capable of sailing on the high seas as well as in narrow rivers. Their design allowed them to be hauled onto land or carried overland to bypass obstacles. Their prow was often decorated with the heads of dragons or serpents to intimidate the enemy and appease the gods. Aboard these ships, warriors sat shoulder to shoulder, each carrying a sword or axe and a round wooden shield. Swords were carefully crafted, adorned with carvings, and considered an extension of the warrior's honor. The axe was not just a tool for combat but a traditional symbol accompanying the Vikings on their wars and voyages. They also used spears, bows, and metal helmets, although the horned helmets were not real, but a modern myth. These tools were not just a means of combat, but also tools of travel and survival, which allowed them to cross continents, confront peoples, and challenge the seas. Their naval technology was the secret to their superiority and spread. Yet, behind these epics, a question plagues historians: was Ragnar Lothbrok a real historical figure, or merely a legendary composite, combining the traits of several leaders under one name, immortalized as a symbol of heroism and defiance in the memory of the North? Contemporary records from his time are almost non-existent. What we know about him mostly comes from the Norse sagas, texts written centuries after his supposed death. These sagas describe him as the son of a Swedish king, marrying the shield maiden Lagertha, and later the princess Aslog, fathering sons like Bjorn Ironside and Ivar the Boneless. These texts recount his raids on Paris, his war against the kingdom of Northumbria, and his tragic death in a pit full of snakes at the hands of King Aella. The problem is that these narratives blend fantasy and history, and there is no conclusive archaeological evidence proving his existence. Even the kings he supposedly fought are mentioned in different time periods, raising doubts about the accuracy of the events. Some historians believe that Ragnar's character may be a composite embodiment of several Norse leaders who lived at different times, including the king Reginhur from Norway who raided Paris in the 9th century, and the Ragnar mentioned in Anglo-Saxon chronicles as the father of Bjorn, real but separate figures whom popular imagination merged into one entity. What makes Ragnar a controversial figure is not only the ambiguity of his existence but the extent of his influence in shaping the image of the Vikings in popular imagination. Over time, he became a symbol of rebellion, leadership, and the man who defies fate, even if he was an illusion. In the modern era, dramatic works like the Viking series have contributed to solidifying his image, despite discrepancies with historical facts. His face became famous, and his story is told as a fixed chapter of history, even though it belongs to a hazy region between reality and myth. Perhaps more important than his actual existence is the role his name played in firing the imagination of generations. Ragnar, whether real or not, has turned into a mirror reflecting humanity's quest for heroism, the unknown, and immortality. When the Vikings are mentioned, bearded warriors and helmets come to mind. But the truth is that women in their society were more than just shadows of men. In Viking society, women enjoyed rights not granted in many contemporary societies. They could own land, inherit wealth, and ask for divorce, and some even participated in the assemblies of law. In some cases, female warriors known as shield maidens appeared, carrying swords and fighting battles, but whether they were entirely real or exaggerated by the sagas remains a matter of debate. What is certain, however, is that women managed the household, supervised laborers, participated in trade, and sometimes accompanied their husbands on voyages. Special rituals were held for them at marriage and death, reflecting their pivotal status in Viking life. Many of the royal tombs discovered belonged to women buried with splendor, reflecting their influence. Thus, Viking civilization cannot be understood without acknowledging the role of women, not just as homemakers, but as active and cohesive pillars of society. In Viking societies, wars, raiding, or even marriage were not undertaken without consulting divination. They believed that destiny was tightly woven by unseen forces, and understanding the future, or at least reading its signs, could give them an advantage in a world full of perils. Thus, the rituals of seer, divination, were born amidst shadows, smoke, and whispering winds. One of the most prominent methods of prophecy known to the Vikings was a ritual called seer, a mysterious magical art often practiced by women called the vulva, seeress. The vulva was considered a mediator between worlds, performing her rituals in a tent or on a hill, holding a sacred wooden staff and wearing an ornate cloak. She would chant in an ancient language and enter a trance state. Through this state, she claimed to communicate with spirits or gods, bringing forth visions, foretelling what would happen, or what to beware of. Seer was not practiced for mere amusement or trickery, but for crucial occasions, before warriors left on a voyage, before a decisive battle, or even to interpret dreams believed to be messages from other realms. It was also common to use signs and symbols, such as the movement of ravens, the behavior of horses, the shape of clouds, or even casting bones or stones on the ground and interpreting their arrangement. Some used runic inscriptions as a means of prognostication, carving symbols onto wood or bone, scattering them, and interpreting their meaning. It was believed these symbols had the power to reveal or even influence events. Curiously, divination was not always the sole domain of women, though men who practiced seer were considered unconventional, perhaps suspicious, in the eyes of society. Yet, some kings themselves, like Odin, the god of wisdom and war, were described as practicing these rituals, giving it added sanctity. However, after the conversion of the Vikings to Christianity, these practices began to be suppressed and condemned as demonic or pagan acts. The vulva vanished, and her tools became museum artifacts, while her stories remained confined to sagas and myths. Despite everything, divination in the Viking Age remains a mirror to their deep connection with the unknown. They knew that the seas could not be sailed by courage alone, but also by the goodwill of the unseen forces. Before we conclude, we must pause briefly to discuss their discovery of the continent of America before Columbus. Centuries before Columbus sailed west, when the Old World was still immersed in its limited perceptions of the Earth's boundaries, there were people challenging the cold and the unknown seas, the Vikings, the northern seafarers whose ambition did not stop at plundering European coasts but extended far beyond. At the heart of these adventures stands the name of Leif Erikson, son of the famous explorer Eric the Red, who founded settlements in Greenland. Born in an environment that knew no rest, he once heard from a sailor about fertile lands lying to the west, beyond the Great Sea fog. Although the idea seemed like madness at the time, the indomitable Viking spirit drove him forward. He sailed with a small crew in their long, extended ships, facing storms and currents until they reached a land no European foot had trod before, a rich land full of forests, wild plants, and rivers. They named it Vinland, or Wine Land, due to the abundance of wild grapes. Modern studies suggest this land is located in what is known today as Newfoundland on the eastern coast of Canada. There, they established a wooden settlement where they lived for some time, benefiting from the abundance of food and natural resources. But they were not alone. They encountered the indigenous people of that land, whom the Vikings called the Skrælings, meaning wretches, a name that appears in ancient Norse records. The relationship between the two parties was not amicable but marked by increasing tensions and violent clashes. Despite their bravery, the Vikings realized that their continued presence in that land was fraught with danger, especially given the lack of support from their mother settlements in Greenland and Iceland. With increasing conflicts and diminishing supplies, they ultimately decided to withdraw and return home. For a long time, historians thought this journey was merely an inherited legend. However, the truth began to emerge in the 20th century when an archaeological site was discovered at Longships Meadows in the far north of Newfoundland. There, remains of structures, hearths, and iron nails were found that matched the Norse construction style of that era. This stunning discovery proved that the Vikings were not just European invaders, but pioneers of exploration who preceded others to the New World by 5 full centuries. Their voyage to Vinland was short-lived but long-lasting in its impact, a testament to humanity's ability to challenge the unknown and its insatiable curiosity for what lies beyond the horizon. The Viking journey to North America is not just a chapter of history, but a witness to the fact that the desire for discovery has always been stronger than geographical limits. As the Viking Age drew to a close, everything changed. What was pagan began to lean towards Christianity, and what was isolated began to open up to Europe. This transition began in the late 10th century when missionary delegations started arriving in the Scandinavian countries. Initially, they were met with rejection, even hostility. But over time, and with pressure from European powers, Viking kings began to adopt Christianity. The first was King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who announced his belief in Christ in the mid-10th century, followed by the kings of Norway and Sweden, albeit gradually and with some resistance. The conversion was not only religious but political, as the chieftains saw that embracing Christianity would give them international legitimacy and allow them to form alliances with the monarchs of Europe. Burial rituals changed, ancient god symbols retreated, and the cross replaced the axe and the church replaced the temple. However, even after the conversion, some of their old traditions remained deeply rooted, appearing in celebrations, songs, and daily customs. Christianity marked the end of a phase and the beginning of the Vikings' integration into the new European fabric. By the beginning of the 11th century, the sun of the Vikings began to set gradually after 2 centuries of dominance, terror, and achievement. The northern kingdoms unified, abandoning raids in favor of building stable states with regular armies and legal systems. The need for external wars decreased, while trade and political ties with Christian Europe increased. The Vikings also faced growing military pressure as England, France, and Germany became more prepared to repel them. With the conversion to Christianity, the raids lost their former spiritual significance, turning from an act of pride into a condemned act. The last major invasion was led by Harald Hardrada, who was killed in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a moment traditionally considered the end of the Viking Age. In the same year, the Normans, descendants of the Vikings, invaded England led by William the Conqueror, marking a symbolic end to the Old Era and the beginning of the Norman era. The Vikings did not disappear but transformed into settled people, building the kingdoms we know today as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The age of invasion had passed, but the Viking spirit remained in literature, myths, and symbols that continue to inspire the world today. Despite the disappearance of the Vikings as a military power, their cultural legacy remained firmly rooted in the memory of Europe and the entire world. They left a clear mark on languages, especially in the northern dialects of England and Scotland, where Norse words are still used today. They also influenced governance systems, bringing the Thing model to the communities where they settled, paving the way for the idea of local democracy. Nordic architectural art, with its intricate carvings and interlocking style, influenced the design of medieval European churches and engravings. They also contributed to the development of navigation, as the design of their longships inspired shipbuilding techniques in Europe for centuries. Even Christianity, when it entered their lands, took on a unique character influenced by ancient pagan customs, giving rise to hybrid symbols combining the cross and the hammer. The Vikings also helped extend trade networks, linking the North Sea to the Baltic Sea and the Islamic East via the Russian rivers. Their legacy is not limited to swords and helmets, but to the ideas, skills, and relationships they redrew on the world map. The Vikings left their mark not only with the sword but with intellect and tireless effort. The Vikings did not initially write their own history. What we know about them came from their enemies, the European bishops and monarchs who suffered from their raids and described them as bloodthirsty monsters from the north. But over time, more balanced accounts emerged, especially in the 13th century when Icelandic scribes began recording the Norse sagas. These sagas, long prose narratives that blended history and myth, shed light on the lives of nobles, warriors, tribal conflicts, and human relations. English and French monastic records also appeared, providing an accurate description of the raids, treaties, and the Vikings' life in their settlements. In the modern era, historians revisited all of this through archaeology, manuscripts, and linguistic evidence. Discoveries like buried ships and royal tombs have helped correct many misconceptions. The Vikings were not merely invaders but builders, explorers, traders, artists, and a people with a complete identity. Today, universities and museums are competing to study their civilization, making the Vikings one of the most re-examined peoples in European history. Their story continues to be written and understood anew, generation after generation. The image of the Viking holds a special place in contemporary popular consciousness, constantly recurring in films, games, and books as a symbol of strength and freedom. However, this image is often distorted or exaggerated, always portraying them as savage warriors wearing horned helmets, which is historically inaccurate. In reality, Vikings never wore horned helmets. That was a romantic image that emerged in the 19th century through European opera and art. Modern series like Vikings and The Last Kingdom have brought them back with great appeal, but often prioritize fiction over accuracy. Nevertheless, these works have contributed to rekindling global interest in Viking civilization, prompting people to seek their origins and read their true history. In Scandinavian countries, the Vikings are celebrated as part of the national identity, with festivals that recreate their battles and ancient rituals. Some of their descendants still proudly claim ancestry from those men and women who fearlessly crossed the oceans. The Vikings have transformed from the nightmare of Europe into a global legend, an inspiration for power, discipline, and defiance. They are now part of global culture, a symbol that does not die. This has been a long journey through the history of the Vikings, from their mysterious beginnings in the frozen north to their maritime empire, and their eventual integration into Christian Europe. We've learned how they started as scattered tribes, unified under the banners of chieftains, conquered the world seas, and founded kingdoms and settlements across continents. We traced their pagan rituals, their way of life, the conflicts they fought, and how Christianity transformed them and reshaped their identity. We saw how their strength was measured not only by swords but by minds, trade, cunning, and the ability to adapt. We learned that the Vikings were not just invaders, but builders, explorers, and creators who left a legacy that transcends time and place. From the coasts of Norway to the rivers of Russia to the islands of England, they were present with power, cunning, and courage. Their story shows that history is not just a series of events, but a chain of transformations, and that peoples are defined not by a single moment but by their entire journey. The history of the Vikings is not only what they did, but the indelible mark they left behind. And so ends this narrative, as an epic concludes. But the lessons remain, and the story endures. If you have made it this far, you have completed the full Viking saga with us, in all its astonishing detail. We thank you for your time and interest and hope this documentary has added a new dimension to your knowledge of Viking civilization. If you enjoyed what you heard, please don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us continue and deliver more. We also invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new documentaries we present with a calm voice and precise knowledge. We also ask you to share your opinion in the comments section. What part fascinated you the most, and what civilizations or stories would you like us to tell you in the future? Every comment you make is a step that helps us plan the next path, so be a partner in choosing the tales. Until we meet in the next episode, be well and stay close to the voice of history, for behind every era there is a story, and behind every civilization, a beat that never dies.